Good evening all and welcome. We have a very fun selection of stories for you today. I do want to warn you though, you are going to get the feel in one of these stories, and there are mentions of people taking their own life, people passing away tragically too early, and other stuff that is generally speaking quite disturbing. So, if this is too much for you, feel free to watch another video, because it's time to get uncomfortable. Grab your tents and let the darkness take control. My story is about a scary experience I had about 15 years ago while exploring Canada that made me feel like I was crazy. When I was 30 years old, I went on a trip alone to explore the boreal forest in Canada and Alaska. I went alone to try and find myself again after going through some very stressful circumstances. But that's a different story, and does have a connection to what happened during my trip. I had planned this trip for close to a year, and spent a lot of money to ensure this trip was what I wanted it to be. It cost close to $70,000 for just over 6 months, which was actually cheap for what I wanted to do. I planned this trip out to be a solo, secluded adventure as much as I could to explore northern remote Alaska and territories of Canada, which included a 4-week camping trip, which is where the horrors begin. I hired some of the indigenous people to help me with my plans. They were very kind and offered me many options to satisfy my request. One of the options they recommended really stood out. However, I did have to allow company for most of the first 3 months of my trip, but the camping trip would be 100% solo. It sounded amazing, so I agreed. I would start in Point Hope, Alaska, and make my way across northern Ontario. The trip would start off by mostly dog sledding, snowmobiling, and other snow vehicles, and flying where it wasn't feasible to travel by land. I would mostly hunt and fish for food, create fires and cook what I caught, but I also brought plenty of survival food. This is why I agreed with the company. They were guides who knew the terrain and how to navigate through it safely. They shared some food they brought with them, like bannock and dried meats like deer, moose, and elk. We would camp out along the way or stay in yurts, sometimes even motels in small towns. They told me stories about tales from their culture, passed down by many generations, and I ended up enjoying their company. The trip was amazing. I saw so much wildlife, and the scenery was amazing, especially the sky. I had never seen northern lights like this before, and the crackling was something I didn't know they did. They were bright, and with how clear I saw the Milky Way, it gave me a sense of peace. I saw a pack of wolves take down a moose, owls, eagles, foxes, and even polar bears, which made my guides a bit nervous, though they did have a firearm for emergencies. We laughed, we had a few drinks, cooked beef, hog, and fish, and had a blast. It was an amazing experience. They guided my journey until we got to Fort Severn, where we would rest for the day. From there we would part ways, and I would continue alone. This is where my trip turns into my most horrifying experience. The next morning I gathered my things, brought a bit of food, and headed out. I planned to head deep into the Ontario boreal forest, alone. I had previously planned a location deep in the forest on my GPS to travel to. I wasn't 100% sure I could make it, but that was part of the challenge. I traveled on foot for 10 hours straight during the day and slept at night in a hammock. It wasn't easy by any means. The forest was dense and hard to tread through, but I was determined. Everything was fine for the first 2 days. I managed to cover about 20 kilometers. But on the third morning I had an eerie feeling. That morning some of my stuff was scattered around, but I told myself it was probably just some animals trying to get at my food. I hung it in a tree. But the weird thing was I didn't hear anything during that night. It was very quiet, with no noises of animals or insects. It didn't occur to me that anything was wrong, so I gathered my things, ate, and headed out again. It started to get dark, so I decided to try and find a good place to sleep for the night. Once I did, I set up camp. This time, everything that wasn't essential was hung in a tree. I lit a fire, made some food, and just enjoyed the scenery as the sun set. Then, once it got really dark, I heard something. It sounded like a very familiar voice of someone calling for help, in a little girl's voice. "Help me, I'm lost." That voice almost made me cry, and it was extremely unnerving. I looked around as best I could, but at that point it was pitch black, and my line of sight was probably 10 feet at best. I called out nervously, "Sherry? Are you okay? Can you see my fire?" The voice changed. It was deeper now, and the hairs on the back of my neck raised, and a sudden sense of danger overwhelmed me. I took out my flashlight and looked around more thoroughly, and that's when I saw it. A figure hunched over within the trees, arms fully stretched out to the sides, with its fingers spread out in an unnatural manner, eyes glowing. It had an oversized mouth, open very wide and smiling. I just stood there trying to comprehend what the hell I was seeing, until its head rotated upside down, and it collapsed onto the ground and started crawling very quickly towards me. I swear I could hear bones snapping. I didn't know what to think, but I heard a whisper, "Run." So I bolted. I left everything I had except the flashlight in my hand and a bit of emergency dried food I had in my pouch. I ran as fast as I could and didn't stop. But I heard it pursuing me and calling me, telling me to stop, in what sounded like the voice of my wife. I kept hearing it. "Please stop, I'm scared." But I ran anyway. I don't know how I managed to navigate through the forest, but I did end up falling down a small hill into a wet mud pit, and I just laid there. In the voice of my wife, I heard her calling me. Sherry was asking me where I was and telling me she was scared. Then, "I'm hungry. Where are you?" Growling, lots of footsteps, but I was so petrified. I just lay there paralyzed with fear like I'd never felt before. That mud pit ended up being my saving grace, because after what seemed like an eternity, the voices stopped, and I heard what sounded like morning birds and the sun begin to rise. I waited until it was fully light out and crawled out of the pit, gathered my head, and checked what I had. A bit of water, a couple of food bars, and thankfully my GPS. I managed to navigate to a country road. It took me another 5 days staying in ditches at night along the road while this thing was trying to hunt me, taunting me with every trick up its sleeve. I think the mud made it lose track of me. During the day I would navigate towards the closest town. Along the way I managed to get to a highway where I saw one lone semi-truck traveling towards the town. I flagged it. The guy, an older gentleman driving, looked and asked if I was okay. All I said was, "I've been lost for over a week straight. I'm running from some animals." He looked at me and said, "You were lucky." The man told me a story about his brother who went hunting in those forests. He said he wouldn't talk about what happened, except that the forest was haunted. Whatever his brother had experienced scared him enough that he never went hunting again. With this in mind, I decided to confide in him and told him what had happened to me. I could see the guy's face get visibly pale, and we were silent for the rest of the ride. He drove me to Kenora, where he let me stay at his place for the night. In the morning, his brother came by. He and the old man talked. The old man's name was Steve and his brother was Jim. Jim looked back at me, eyes wide, and I nodded back at him. We both shared our stories. What I described was exactly what he saw. I ended up staying in Kenora, and we all became pretty good friends. But Steve died about 3 months after this. He was 63. His brother and I stayed friends for about 2 years, until he passed of liver failure. He was an alcoholic. Not that it wasn't sad. I tried my best to get him to stop drinking, but the nightmares kept him reliving that experience. I had them too, so I understood he needed an escape. I too became an alcoholic. The nightmares were just too much. His friendship meant a lot to me. Afterwards, about another year, I moved to Winnipeg and tried to get my life in order. I joined AA and got clean. This is where I met my current friends. I told my story at a meeting and I started with, "I don't care if you think I'm crazy." So that's my story. I think some important backstory to help fill in the gaps are the following. Sherry was my daughter. She was 5, but got cancer and never made it. She died 4 months after her diagnosis. My wife couldn't take the pain and ended up taking her own life 6 months after Sherry passed away. It was her voice that told me to run. After their passing, I was destroyed. So much that I planned this trip not to find myself. But what I really meant to say is that I planned this trip to take my life in the most isolated place possible. I was going to do it in the same way she did, with a rope, but deep in the forest. Because I wanted to rot. That's how I felt inside, rotten. I used my entire life savings to plan this trip, because I had no intention to return. I think back to this day many times. It made me reconsider taking my life, and I went to therapy. I'm still working towards coming to terms with my past, but things are much better now. Wyoming is a strange place, vast and empty, yet filled with ruthless wildlife and nature. Even the most mundane can be the most terrifying when you're alone in the woods. The year was 2020. I was jobless and without a care in the world. Unemployment checks were coming in, and for the first time in my young life, I had enough money to put down on a brand new shiny car. I went to the dealership and pretty much chose the first car I saw. A 2008 RAV4. Mind you, I know it's not a brand new car, but to me it was a car made of solid gold, and I'd never owned anything with less than 200,000 miles on it at that point. It was freeing to buy a brand new car with no problems. I'd gotten a clean bill of health from my mechanic, and figured there was no other way to break it in than a road trip. My old friend had been car camping across the US at that point, and we made a plan to meet in Wyoming for the first real outdoor excursion of my life. I packed a sleeping bag, a tent, and other gear I could fit in, and drove my way out to the Medicine Bow National Forest to meet my friend. The drive there was an experience itself. No cell service, empty roads, and only us and the dry, dense trees. It was nearing the middle of June as we drove our rigs out into the middle of the forest. Giant snowdrifts still lay on most of the dirt roads, making some entirely impassable, but the glacier lilies and grape hyacinths were slowly peeping their heads out, and the blades of fresh, green grass crept through the patches of ice and snow. The forest was still reawakening from its chilly slumber, and it made the whole landscape that much more ethereal. The birds were singing, the bugs were beginning to buzz after a long winter, and we drove through the trees, north as far as we could go, passing through large swaths of burn scar that became more and more apparent as we pressed on. The landscape was still beautiful, but there was something unnerving about all those dead trees, and the way they creaked in total silence. Light began to fade, and we landed in a campsite that was a partial burn scar, most likely from a fire decades before. The singed trees gave way to a breathtaking view of the Alpine Mesa. We lit a small fire and set up a camp as we caught up on each other's lives. It was pitch dark as we sat over the campfire, roasting brats and laughing over old memories. When I saw it, it started as a sliver of light on the horizon, thin but bright. It looked like a car that had its brights on, far, far away. But the thing was, we were on one of the last accessible roads. There were no other roads in that direction, only dead, fallen trees for miles. But the light got brighter. "What is that?" I finally exclaimed. My friend looked over his shoulder and was just as bewildered as I was. It was so bright, and it appeared to be coming closer and brighter. Suddenly, the thought of a forest fire flashed through my mind. I'm sure the same idea went through my friend's head as we both locked eyes and shot up out of our seats. The light was captivating, hypnotizing almost, but time was short. We scurried around the camp in a frenzy trying to track down our things. The light became larger and brighter. I had never seen anything so bright in the pure dark before, and as it grew in size, so did my fear. Was it another camper driving aimlessly through the forest? A fire? A bomb? The end of the world? In a strange moment, we both stopped and looked towards the light. The sliver had turned into a blinding cascade of light, and it grew. The trees around us lit up, and their strange, scraggly shadows were cast down upon the ground. We looked onward, bathed in the light of this great, bright thing. What was it? With the silence, up it crept. That's when we realized it was the moon. A full moon, the fullest I'd ever seen it. We laughed hysterically as the moon rose, teasing ourselves for getting so paranoid. Spirits returned to normal, and we settled in for a chilly night of sleep. To this day, I've never seen a moon so big and bright as the one that evening, and I think it's pretty silly for one person to mistake the moon for a forest fire, but for two, that's a little weird. Maybe this was a warning, a foreshadowing of strange things to come. At least, maybe that's how I should have seen it at the time, if I'd have known what lay ahead of me. The next morning I woke up. It was chilly. There was a slight mist on my breath, and I wriggled out of my sleeping bag. We couldn't have gotten off to a better start. It was a beautiful early summer day. The sun was shining with only a few small puffy clouds speckled across the big blue sky. Sam and myself packed our remaining gear and got back on the rough back roads of Medicine Bow National Forest. Today we were heading even more north, to a large but secluded reservoir in the middle of the forest. We had lost most of our Google Map data, but as we'd gotten further in and both of our cars were without GPS/touchscreen, but as I'd learnt from my former analog camping escapades, you gotta look for the big brown signs. That usually leads you the way. I didn't think twice about not having a physical map with us, but hindsight is 2020. It was strange having the roads all to ourselves. You would think the place would be infested with four-wheelers and happy campers, but the mix of the 2020 pandemic and an extra wet winter left scant others on the trail. The further we went, the less people we saw, until eventually we hadn't come across another person in several hours. The roads had gotten progressively worse as we drove along. Large, muddy ruts turned into slushy portholes that would explode into a rainbow of ice and shards with each tire rotation. I followed closely behind Sam's 4Runner, rolling along in my stock summer tires as best I could in the ever-deepening snow. But there came a point in the road where even Sam second-guessed getting across. There were a few logs lodged into the drift to help with traction, so even if it was still a good 3 feet of slushy wet snow, Sam approached cautiously, but with a few spins of the tires he made it across the drift. Now it was my turn. Call it stupidity, inexperience, or whatever you want. I was determined to make it over that pile of snow. I didn't want to come off as the fearful little girl that couldn't do tough outdoor stuff. And once Sam was across, I put the pedal to the metal and gunned my little RAV4 across the snow. I heard my car revving and groaning as I pushed on, only to come to a spluttering stop in the middle of the snowdrift. Tried as I might, I couldn't roll forward and I couldn't go back. My car had sunken into the soft snow, and I was stuck in the equivalent of cold quicksand. Now, we weren't totally unprepared. Sam had a couple of tow straps. The challenge was finding a way to attach them onto my car and drag it out. My hands were frozen and scratched from the ice as we dug with any shovel-type instruments we could find. It took some time, but inch by inch we wriggled my car free. Not without damage, though. We had ripped off my undercarriage cover in the process, and who knew what else that couldn't be seen with the naked eye. I was pissed, but mostly with myself for being such an idiot. Not only had I damaged my brand new car, but the road was now totally inaccessible after our laborious snow-digging operation. The piles of slush and mud made it impossible for either of us to turn back the way we came. Thankfully, we were pressing on north using a different route, but with each mile we drove, I felt less and less confident. If there was this big old pile of snow on one of the main back roads, who's to say how the other roads would look further on? We arrived at the reservoir by mid-afternoon, hungry and irritable. Our thoughts soon melted away with the summer sun and waterside views. The reservoir wasn't officially open for the season due to COVID, so we were met with empty beaches and the soft sounds of waves on the shore. It was very peaceful, and very much needed, after spending the last few hours digging my car out of the snow. Little did we know the clouds on the horizon were dark ones. The white puffballs of the morning had turned an ominous black, and a chill wind had swiftly picked up. Something was coming. We sat on the beach for what felt like ages, simply absorbing the last 24 hours. It's crazy how time can stretch when you're out in the wild. The trek out, the night before, the car getting stuck. Things that would feel so mundane or mildly inconvenient in day-to-day life felt like a momentous event out here in the middle of nowhere. The calm waves became louder, more rushed as they lapped against the eroded rocks of the shore on which we sat. The summer sun slid behind the cloud, and the balmy 70-degree day dropped to a quick 30 within the span of us walking from the beach back to our car. Like a whisper, a single snowflake fell on my windshield as I shut my driver door, and I knew we were in for a storm. As a Colorado child, I was raised to laugh in the face of snow, especially in June, but our measly storms were no match for those of Wyoming. A few flakes flattened and fell in large clumps as we traversed our way into the trees. Our route was to take less than an hour and got us just outside the small town of Centennial, maybe, if we went quickly. We could outrun the storm, if we were lucky. Maybe we'd find even a hotel for the night and wait out the cold weather. Optimism is futile in the wild. Practicalism is a much better option. We drove on and the snow got worse. I squinted and white-knuckled my wheel while I navigated the rotted road that was coated in fresh powder. Sam was only a few feet ahead of me, but I was having trouble keeping track of him. When heavy snow falls that fast, it's like trying to stare through the static on a television. It had just been over an hour when Sam came to a sudden stop, and it took me a second to see why. But smack dab in front of us was a snowdrift on the road that was at least 10 feet tall. Our way out was impassable. It snowed harder. Sam ran out from his car to my window. We had to make a plan fast. We had no GPS, no maps, no cell phone service, and zero way out in the middle of a summer blizzard, by which we were completely unprepared for. Our best bet was to head back towards the reservoir, but even now that was an hour away, and all of the already foreign roads were covered in a blanket of snow. We did our best to retrace our tracks, but we were losing daylight fast. We'd go down a road, certain it was the way back, only to be met with a dead end or snowdrift. Over an hour, we'd try a road dead end and turn back around, bringing my gas tank then less than half full. Finally, with a stroke of luck, we found a familiar-looking clearing with a road that we were relatively sure would take us back to the reservoir. It was almost dark, and the snow was now impossible to drive in with my summer tires. So, knowing we were on the right track, we finally pulled off to make camp. As I put my car in park, I looked out the window onto a group of nearby moose stampeding through the clearing. The snow swirled around their black silhouettes as they pounded towards the forest. The silence after was deafening. We were all alone here. As you would imagine, we weren't expecting a winter storm in the middle of June, and I wasn't prepared for it either. Back then, I was still relying on a Walmart camping setup, and that was maybe good for sleeping in the 40s to 50s range. The heaviest jacket I had was a sweatshirt and a raincoat, no gloves. My cheap butane stove barely lit in the cold temperatures, and food supplies were dwindling fast. I couldn't keep my car running for heat, because we had no extra gas, and no idea how long it would take to find a new route to asphalt. The cold set in, and reality. I felt broken as I started to shiver. The epic camping trip was turning out to be a lot more epic than I expected, and I was beginning to get scared. Sam was faring better than I, but still had a tinge of anxiety in his manner. Our way out was blocked. The way we came in was blocked, even more so with the fresh snow. There were plenty of roads around us, but we were effectively stuck in a labyrinth without a map. There was no way to tell which of the roads would be blocked by mounds of snow, and which would lead us out there, if we could even get out. We were lost in Wyoming. The next day I woke up with a thud. I didn't remember falling asleep, but the constant howl the wind had played through my ears the entire night. And then another. I realized it was snow falling on the roof of my car. I suddenly remembered where I was and sat up. Dawn had broken, and the sun was peeling through in glints and glimpses through the low-lying clouds and fog. A few wisps of snow fluttered through the air, but for the most part the storm had passed. It seemed like it would be a grey day, and it was time to assess the damage and pee. It had been a while. I didn't even remember drinking water the day before. I tore away my insulating blanket and cracked open the car door. It looked like a winter wonderland outside. The thin, dry pines were now girthy with snow. The roads were no longer covered in snow, but were left with a slushy, wet crust that crunched as you walked. It was cold, and the clumps of snow in the trees started falling faster in a rhythmic thumping to the ground. Sam's car door creaked open and he peeked out, looking just as bewildered as I felt. We were not exactly prepared for this winter storm. We had no map, GPS, and no cell service, and my car had these stupid summer tires. And who knows what kind of extra damage had been done, especially after being pulled out of the snowdrift. My gas tank was less than half full, after trying to backtrack to the reservoir, and there was no way I could drive until the roads dried out and we found a solid way out. We could use Sam's 4Runner to drive around and search, but he had less gas than I did. We relied too heavily on stockpiling up in the next town. All of our supplies, including food, were getting dangerously low. We couldn't even make a fire because everything was soaked. We made the decision, right then and there, that we weren't going anywhere in the cars that day. Today would be a snow day. In times of unexpected crisis, there is some solace in finding humor in the situation. I didn't want to focus on the fact that we were stuck, or lost, or almost out of food. At first, we stuck to our campsite. We had landed in quite a beautiful spot. It was the start of a small clearing with a rocky creek nearby. The moose from the night before would occasionally walk out on the far opposite end of the clearing, and we watched on as they scavenged for food under the fresh snow. The fog began to clear out, and we slowly ventured further from the cars, only to realize the creek got larger and wider, and eventually it fed into the reservoir. It was only about a mile away. We were much closer than we thought. Our best idea of the whole trip, in my opinion, was to walk to the parking area of the reservoir and see if there was a map. It was maybe 2 miles, but now that we had our bearings, we were ready to skip in leaps and bounds to the reservoir. It was as if nature sensed the positive vibes, and the sun came out to shine our way towards the shore. Just as we hoped, a map came in sight as we walked down the roads to the picnic tables and bathrooms. It seemed like the road went in a giant loop around the reservoir, and we followed the loop. The road would connect back to Fox Park, where we all started. There was really only 3 ways in and out of this area, and this was our last option, with the other 2 roads being blocked. If we wanted to get out, or at least try, this was the way to do it. With that, we meandered along the creek back towards the cars with high hopes. As we got closer, though, I noticed a small white cross nailed to a tree atop of a small rocky outcrop. We walked towards it, minding each icy rock as we went. It appeared to be some sort of memorial or grave for something or someone. Years of sun and ice had bleached most of the writing away. Once we realized what it was, we both fell silent and stepped off the large rocky mound. We beelined it towards the campsite that was only a few hundred feet away. Some of the wood had dried out enough for a small fire, and we'd sat closely huddled together and made my last packet of ramen. After this, all I had was a protein bar, an onion, and some instant coffee. I really didn't want to eat that onion. The sun set, and with the warm spirit of the day, the cold uncertainty returned. I went to bed early, but woke up in the dark at around 3 a.m. as I heard a loud noise outside and sat up. The silhouette of a single moose stood outside my car, no more than 5 feet away, completely still. His antlers looked like large hands splayed upwards towards the starry sky. The silhouette of his massive body was like some sort of contorted human, and he stood there watching like a statue, completely motionless in the dark. I lay back down silently, hoping this to be a good omen, albeit a frightening one. Tomorrow we would tell. When dawn came, I was sure we would be ridding ourselves of this mud-forsaken labyrinth. My eyes fluttered open to the ceiling of my car, frost and condensation stuck to the windows. Not as cold as yesterday, but not warm either. The sun gleamed down on the remaining snow outside. There was a good amount of melt overnight. The roads weren't dry, but there were a lot more than yesterday. It was decided that we both go, leave our small camping hovel behind. It was much better to get closer to civilization than it was to stay here. If we couldn't get out, then others couldn't get in. We warmed our cars and our bodies with the remaining instant coffee and hopped on the road. There was no sense in wasting time. We followed the road towards the reservoir, and I couldn't help but feel a little sad to leave our snow globe of solitude. I don't know if it was the isolation or the sheer intensity of everything that had happened, and could potentially happen in the next few hours. But part of me just wanted to stay in that spot forever. It was so peaceful, unnervingly peaceful, and just as we passed the bullet-ridden stop sign to the reservoir, I saw 2 moose far across the clearing, standing there motionless in our direction. I felt like they didn't want us to leave, that we were some new entertainment for them after long months of winter. The reservoir came into our sights and we headed straight, past the parking lot in mere minutes compared to our 45-minute walk the other day. It had seemed like such a journey of survival only 24 hours ago, wondering if we would find a map and a way out. Now it was just another blip on the screen of our memories. The road began to branch off like a tree, endless openings to unmanned roads leading to who knows where. Everything was hidden by the trees. We did our best to follow the small, brown number signs and veered left along the reservoir edge. I was hopeful, elated even, when I saw us winding our way closer and closer to the dam far off on the other side. I could almost taste a fresh gas station breakfast burrito. Just as we were approaching the final set of curves, the unthinkable came into sight. We had dealt with mud and snow, but the last thing we planned for were trees, and right there in the middle of the route was a large group of dead, fallen pines. We had saw and an axe, but it would have taken literal days for the two of us to hack and lever those trees off the road. Trust me when I say we seriously considered spending the rest of our day hacking through those trees, but it would have been futile. Our final way out was blocked. We had no choice but to turn back. To say I was upset was an understatement. I was cold, tired, hungry, and very low on gas. But with each passing mile, the thoughts of abandoning the cars to walk to help became more of a reality. From the map at the reservoir, it had shown 3 routes in and out of the area, and we had now found all 3 blocked. We hadn't seen signs of another human in days. We weren't left with many other options. But once again, we had to make a new plan. I was now turning truly into survival mode, and if we went on in both cars, we both risked emptying our gas tanks and ending up further into the forest if we ventured on. If we left one car, we could use the other to explore some of the infinite amount of backroads that surrounded us. But, as was the challenge in the days before, we didn't know which would be blocked, or if any would lead us out. We finally decided that our best bet would be to go back to the reservoir, back the initial way we came in, and spend the rest of the day shoveling away as much snow and ice as we could to get through. It was not a promising plan, but it was better than trying to saw through hundreds of pounds of logs, or wasting more gas and getting more lost. The drive back around the water's edge was not a pleasant one. The positive and nostalgic vibes I had woken up to had evaporated, and it was a hard lesson to not get too set on one plan in a survival situation, because more often than not, the plan wasn't going to work out as you anticipated. We approached a crossroad that would take us back the way we came, and I rolled down my window to bring in some fresh air and clear my mind. That's when I heard something very faint over the rumbling of our cars. Zoom. A flash of red sped by us, 2 more. It was a gaggle of ATVs driven by some old men in ratty old sweatshirts, ripped jeans, and trucker hats, going in the opposite direction of the reservoir. My eyes widened, and before I could think or say anything, Sam's 4Runner kicked mud into my windshield and started going left. I followed. We didn't see the ATVs anymore, but the road was wet enough that we could still follow their tracks. They continued straight for a while, and eventually came to a large fork and veered left deeper into the trees. It was only now that I thought about the possibility of them going for a joyride, and we were throwing ourselves deeper into the forest. But if they had experienced anything like us, 90% of the roads out here were impassable. And if they had to turn around, it seemed like there was no better help to get out than some backwoods Wyoming folks. We drove on, and the snowdrifts around us dissipated. The mud-slushed road was now mostly dry, save for a few water-filled potholes. Bugs started buzzing. The color of the fresh flowers I had seen driving in those days before reappeared on the sides of the road. And finally a cabin. I wanted to scream with joy. Just as we passed a few more cabins, my phone buzzed, and for the first time in days I had service. Sam and I stopped for a brief moment to indulge in our phones. I saw texts from my mum, but I had told her not to expect anything from me in a few days, as service in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming can be hit or miss. Little did she know. A few Snapchat notifications, but for the most part, everything seemed entirely normal, and it was just another unremarkable June day. Finding cell service didn't solve all our problems, though. We were both at less than a quarter of a tank by now, and doubted we could get a Fox Park and Centennial with what was left. Cautiously, we decided to drive on the back roads to the small town of Albany, and onto the closest gas station in Centennial. It cut our miles in half, and we made sure to take plenty of screenshots of the map route, something we half chuckled that we should have done days before. The roads were now bone dry as we rode on. The temperature rose significantly, and for the first time in days it was hot. My windows were rolled down, and I invited the warmth and sound of the cheerful summer birds. The roads descended slowly into a large valley that could be caught in glimpses through the thinning trees, and eventually a small town came into view. Albany. We slowed to a rolling stop as we saw sleepy locals ending their days in the surrounding houses. Neighbors were chatting on the sidewalk with their dogs, happily distracted by the bountiful wildlife that had re-emerged after the cold storm. I laughed as the dusty asphalt of the road came into view. It was the first I had seen in days. My shoulders relaxed as we drove on and picked up speed, flying towards the gas station as fast as we could. It felt good to know where we were. We were no longer lost in Wyoming. We were on the road again. The only remaining evidence of our passing there was where the settling dust on the old, rutted back roads were, on the Medicine Bow. A few years ago, I had an experience that still haunts me. Back then, I was drowning in the chaos of college and city life, so I escaped for a long weekend to the woods, chasing what city folks call lunacy, but for those of us who live for the wild, know as pure freedom. Deep winter camping, completely alone, no phone signal, no other humans, just me and the biting cold. I've always loved being alone out there. In the city as a woman, I felt trapped, eyes always watching, steps measured, always cautious. But in the woods, I had it all to myself. After driving for hours, the asphalt faded beneath thickening pines and frost-coated branches. I parked at a narrow roadside ditch, grabbed a map and a compass, and hiked deep into the silent wilderness. About 4 miles from the road, I made a tiny camp in a small clearing. Just a hole dug into the snow for my little tent and a modest fire, barely enough to keep the chill at bay. For 2 days, the woods whispered only their quiet secrets. Snow muffled my footsteps, birds chirped faintly overhead, and far off, half-frozen waterfalls murmured like ghostly echoes. Then came the day I planned to go ice fishing. The frozen lake was a mirror of untouched ice, so still it felt like I was the only living thing in the universe. I punched a hole, plunged my line beneath the thin crust, and waited. My first catch came fast. The fish was hungry and desperate under the ice. But as I prepared to clean my prize, fatigue and an uneasy jitter crawled up my spine. My hands trembled while my knife slipped twice, slicing into my palm. A faint, persistent sound nagged at the edge of my hearing, like a faint whistle barely audible, almost swallowed by the cold air. I cursed, focused on the fish, and the whistling grew louder. A slow, eerie melody that crawled around the trees like a dark serpent, winding through the branches. It wasn't natural, not here in the wilderness, where the only sounds should be birds or wind. Suddenly I shouted in anger, "Piss off with that whistling!" And the sound stopped instantly. A silence so heavy fell that it pressed into me hard. Nothing moved. No response. No footsteps, no voice yelling back. Just an empty, chilling stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. Hunters didn't whistle in these woods. Anyone close enough to hear me would have answered, yelled back, cursed, or anything. But no, just silence that felt like a trap. I shrugged it off as nerves, grabbed my gear and headed back to camp. Then, maybe a quarter mile from my little sanctuary, I saw it. A massive, dark shape, half buried in the snow. My breath hitched, my skin crawled. It was a moose, or what was left of one. The animal lay grotesquely still, eyes wide open and frozen, staring straight at me. The bullet had pierced one eye clean through. Blood stained the snow. It wasn't just a kill. Was it a message? Something about that frozen stare filled me with an ancient dread I couldn't quite place. The forest itself seemed to lean in, watching, waiting for my very move. And I ran. Branches slapped my face, snow struck at my boots, and my breath burned cold in my lungs as I stumbled blindly through them. I knew the general direction, south towards the road east of my camp, but everything was a blur of white and dark trunks. The shadows grew longer, and the silence thickened. When I finally broke through the trees, the empty road stretched ahead, desolate and cold. My truck was parked just yards away. I jumped inside, locking the doors, hearing my heart pounding like a war drum. I didn't care about my gear or my tent anymore, I just wanted out. I drove 15 miles to the nearest motel, trembling and soaked with cold sweat, my mind racing. That night, watching the late-night infomercials with trembling hands, it started to come together. Why did the park allow hunting so close to free camping? Why was there a moose kill so deep in the woods 5 miles from any road? The moose was too fresh for a kill abandoned for long, but the scene was brutal. The next morning, sleep-deprived and paranoid, I told the park ranger everything. The whistle, the moose, the creeping dread. He frowned, more worried about illegal hunting than my shaking story. He wanted to check the site with me, and I insisted he bring a firearm, and he begrudgingly agreed. On an ATV, we tore through the woods, the cold air biting at my face as I clung to the back. We found the spot, a deep, fresh impression in the snow, blood everywhere, drag marks stretched smoothly like the moose had been pulled on a tarp. The ranger looked grim. "Let's get you out of here," he said quietly, when I pointed towards my camp. Following the drag marks, I saw the fear flicker in his eyes. Back at the motel that night, my phone rang. It was the ranger. "They dragged the moose right to your campsite," he said in a low voice. "It's a huge mess. Not sure if animals helped, but someone cut into your tent with a knife." My stomach turned. "What about my stuff?" "You don't want it back. It's covered in moose mess." "So what now?" I asked. "We'll keep an eye out. No one's ever seen anything like this before. Sorry it happened." There was no closure. No answer. Just the haunting memory of that whistling, that bloody stare, and the invisible watcher who stalked me through the woods, obviously didn't like me asking him to be quiet, and left a grisly reminder. I don't think it's a stretch to think this person had a very bad intention for me. And in the years since, I've tried to rationalize it. Some desperate hunter, a psychopath, a twisted woodsman playing God. One friend jokingly called him Moosey Todd, a killer lurking behind the trees. But all that I know is that I will never camp alone in the woods again. I was about 20 feet up, in my climber stand, one cold October evening, nestled against the trunk of an old cedar tree in a forgotten patch of forest just outside of Coos Bay, Oregon. The chill off the Pacific had settled in early that year, and the sky was already dimming into a soft, bruised purple as the sun slipped behind the coastal hills. I'd been hunting since early afternoon with no luck. No deer, no elk, not even the usual crows, just wind and silence. The land I was on used to be a dense fir plantation, but it had been clear-cut about 3 years now, and the view stretched out across the dead stumps and regenerating brush for hundreds of yards. On the far edge of that clear-cut was a dense wall of second-growth timber, thick with alder and vine maple. That's where the noise started. At first it was just a faint rustling. It could have been the wind stirring the leaves, but I've hunted these woods for years, long enough to know the difference between a breeze and movement. This was movement, and deliberate, heavy. I paused, mid-pack, one boot still unstrapped from the stand, and just listened. The rustling grew louder, not frantic like a raccoon or erratic like a squirrel. This was slower, heavier. It had rhythm to it, 2 steps pause, then another 2. That's when a pit formed in my stomach. In this part of Oregon, bears are common, especially in this time of year. I figured maybe it was one foraging, but the way the brush moved, it didn't seem right. Bears shuffle, amble, but this sounded upright. Light was fading fast, but the horizon still threw enough of a glow that I could make out shapes against the tree line. That's when I heard the snap. A violent, dry crack like a giant piece of kindling being broken in 2. My head whipped towards the sound. One of the young pines, maybe a foot thick at the base, just folded like paper, snapped about 3 feet off the ground, and toppled forward with a rustle and a thud. And that is where I saw it. Just beyond the falling tree. For the briefest second, something moved. A massive blur. Dark brown, maybe even black, with a shaggy coat that caught the last slivers of twilight. It moved in one fluid stride into the thicker timber, upright, fast, and far too big to be a man. Whatever it was had to be over 7 feet tall. My body reacted before my brain caught up. Cold, instinctual fear surged through me like electricity. My breath caught in my throat, and I all but leapt out of the climber. I didn't bother with ropes or proper descent. I hit the ground hard, stumbled once, then ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was in my truck, parked a 1/4 of a mile down the logging road, hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. Of course, the first thought that flashed through my mind was Bigfoot, but I've never been the kind to buy into cryptids or campfire stories. So now, I can't even bring myself to say what I saw. But I know animals, and I know the forest. And whatever that was, it wasn't anything I've ever known. I still hunt in that region sometimes, but I haven't gone back to that particular ridge since. It's not the kind of fear that you can easily shake off. It stays with you and makes you second-guess every twig snap and shadow. I'll probably never know what I saw that night, but I know for damn sure that it saw me. Last summer, I spent 2 months solo road tripping across the US. I was living out of my car, chasing national parks, small towns, and whatever weird roadside attractions I stumbled across. It was mostly incredible, until northern Arizona, where things got real dark. I'd just left Walnut Canyon National Monument way later than I'd planned, and the sun was nearly down. I figured I'd find a spot to camp wherever I ended up, but I'd been on empty for about 30 miles, and there hadn't been a gas station in ages. Nerves were starting to set in. Just as I was starting to mentally prepare for running out of gas in the middle of nowhere, I saw a wooden sign for a campground nailed to a crooked post. No services, no ranger station, just an arrow and a name. Coyote Flats. Desperate, I followed the dirt road deep into the forest, and I mean deep. Miles off the highway, with no reception and no lights, just the crunch of gravel and the rising unease in my gut. At the very first sight, I spotted a couple in their mid to late 20s sitting around a fire pit with a rusty blue cooler between them. I pulled over, hopped out, and asked if they knew how far the next gas station was. They seemed friendly enough. The guy, lanky with hollow cheeks and a fixed smile, told me it was only 2 miles ahead, but sadly already closed for the night. The woman added that the site next to them was open, and that I was welcome to use it. I hesitated, but exhaustion and low gas won, and I started setting up my tent. My rock hammering attempt to stake it down wasn't going well, and before I could blink, the guy appeared beside me with an axe in hand. "Here," he said, grinning. "Let me help." Creepy, absolutely, but he did get the stakes in faster. Trying to play it cool, I offered him a beer. Seemed neighborly. He took it, and a few minutes later, the woman came over and asked if I had any pills. I blinked. "Just ibuprofen," I offered. She looked up disappointed until I said I had some weed from Washington, and that perked her up. Then they reminded me to pay for the site multiple times. Said there was a self-service box down the trail. I said I didn't have any cash. They said, "No problem, just write your credit card number down." And my inner alarm started screaming. To make things worse, the woman insisted I meet the neighbors, and she led me to an RV tucked deeper in the woods. It looked like it hadn't moved in years. Flat tires, cardboard in the windows, and a pile of beer cans outside. Inside was a wasted older man who slurred his way through a story that spiraled into a Jeffrey Dahmer cannibalism joke. A woman stood at the stove cooking greasy tacos and insisted I eat one, and a dog stared at me like I might be on the menu. When the punchline landed, something about eating what you catch, the taco was already in my hand. I made some excuse, bolted out, and tossed the taco to the dog, who followed me all the way back. I chugged half a beer and sat in my camp chair pretending to chill, while trying to figure out if I was about to be robbed, eaten, or both. The younger guy wandered over again, said they'd been camping there for 2 weeks because money ran out, and the older woman in the trailer started screaming at the old man. "That's it, I'm leaving next ride out," she shouted. The younger woman came over and casually offered to ride with me to the gas station so I wouldn't get lost. I smiled and took another long sip of my beer, heart pounding. I told them I needed to check something, went back to my site, and tore everything down in record time. Tent, tarp, fly, all. Shoved it in my trunk like a reverse Tetris game, and was out of there in under 5 minutes. The gas station was closed, but I'd passed a little bed and breakfast not far back, pulled into it and told the woman at the desk I had a strange encounter and needed a safe place to crash. The room was way out of my budget, but she let me use the parking lot, the bathroom, and promised a coffee in the morning. When the sun came up, I fueled up and left Cottonwood, Arizona like it was on fire. I still don't know if those people meant me harm, but I've never been so sure that staying could have meant vanishing without a trace. I've only camped alone once in my life, despite having done over 30 backcountry treks with other hikers. It happened a few years ago, in the San Juan National Forest in southwest Colorado. I'd planned a solo overnight, just me, my gear, and a break from everything. It was early fall, crisp and dry, and the aspens were starting to go gold. I parked my bike near a Forest Service gate and hiked in a few miles before cutting off trail to find a discreet spot. I wasn't technically allowed to camp where I was, so I pushed deeper into the trees, maybe a quarter of the mile off the path, just far enough to feel hidden. The sun was setting when I set up my little one-person tent on a flat patch under a big ponderosa pine. I got a fire going, boiled some water for dinner, and the woods turned quiet and thick with shadow. I didn't mind the solitude, at least not yet. The flicker of the fire, the dry crackle of needles beneath it, and the distant sound of owls made it feel like a perfectly peaceful night. But that peace snapped at around 10 p.m. It started with faint rustling, subtle but deliberate, not wind, not a squirrel. Something heavier, moving with intention. So I clicked on my headlamp and scanned the trees. 4 pairs of eyes blinked back at me from the underbrush. Low to the ground and shifting slightly were coyotes. I know better than most that coyotes rarely pose a threat to a grown woman, especially one yelling and tossing rocks, which I did. But they didn't run. They didn't even flinch. They circled just outside the reach of the firelight, eyes glinting every time I swept my beam towards them. They weren't curious. They were watching. I sat frozen for a minute, heart pounding in my throat. Every primal part of my brain screamed, "You are prey." I tried to keep calm, but the fear wasn't rational. It was ancient, and I couldn't shake the image in my mind of their teeth coming at me from the darkness. I packed my tent in record time, stuffed everything into my pack, and hiked out by headlamp, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I made it back to the road and waited on the asphalt beside my bike until they arrived. I haven't solo camped since, probably never will. Even knowing the odds were slim being alone in the woods with nothing but a thin piece of nylon between me and the dark, it still felt like I was offering myself up, daring something to come closer and take a bite out of me if it were hungry enough. I've decided to share this story in case anyone has had a similar experience. In the summer of 2023, I was camping with my family in Beaver Creek Campground in Montana for a few nights while visiting Yellowstone. The first night there was the most unsettling experience I have ever had. My mother, stepfather, and his brother had all gone to sleep around midnight, while I stayed up for about an hour by the fire. It was pitch black when I decided to snuff the fire and head to my tent to sleep. After around 20 minutes of laying in my tent, I began to hear sniffling noises from immediately outside the tent. Fearing it was a bear, I froze. This continued for a while, until I heard the familiar breathing and shaking noise of a dog. I relaxed, supposing a nearby camper's dog had wandered. I stopped hearing the dog after a while, but then I heard footsteps walking around our campsite and the sound of a large stick being dragged along the ground all around. Then I was frozen in fear at the possibility of a stranger walking around our campsite in the pitch darkness. Suddenly, an obvious camera flash had gone on right in front of my tent. I was frozen in fear. Later, it felt as though an animal or person had laid down and cradled in the corner of my tent. I felt pressure for about 5 minutes and kept feeling as if something was lightly fidgeting with the corners of the tent. Still frozen, I prayed for this to stop. But I was then forced to make this person or whatever acknowledge my presence and my awareness of the situation when I sensed another touch on the zipper of my tent door. I called out loudly, "Who's there?" My stepdad awoke and called out to me while I was too afraid to open my door. 10 seconds passed when I knew he was out of his tent with his gun, and then I emerged. However, there was nothing there, and after I called out I didn't hear or sense any movement going away from the campsite. All the while my mum and stepdad have a dog in their tent, which reacted to nothing the whole time. I slept in my car for the next 2 nights, and nothing else happened. But has anyone else had a weird encounter like this in Montana, or near Yellowstone or in general? I hope you appreciate this story, and if you have, I'd love to hear from you. I've got to give my dad some serious credit for this one. It still stands out as one of the coolest and calmest moves I've ever seen. We were on a camping trip as a family, just my mum, my dad, and my younger brother and me. I was probably around 8, my younger brother even younger, and because we were kids we all shared one big tent. It was the kind of trip where everything felt like an adventure. And that night, it was pitch dark outside with no moon, no campfire, and just the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. We were all zipped up in our sleeping bags when we started hearing this strange sound. Something scratching against the side of the tent. Not clawing exactly, but definitely enough to make us all freeze. Then came the sniffling, heavy and deliberate sniffling. Whatever it was inches away from us, separated only by a thin layer of nylon. My mum tensed up immediately. My brother and I whispered to each other wide-eyed, trying to guess the kind of forest creature that was creeping around our tent. After a few minutes, the sounds shifted. We heard it move towards the picnic table just outside the tent, and then, unmistakably, the sound of something tearing into food. We had left a few things out. Rookie mistake. My mum began to panic, whispering to my dad, asking what it was and if we should do something. My dad, totally calm, quietly unzipped the front of the tent just enough to peek out. He looked out for a few moments and carefully zipped it closed again and lay back down. "It's just a raccoon," he said softly. His voice was steady and casual. My mum tried to relax, but she still looked worried. My brother and I were kind of relieved. A raccoon sounded manageable. We all lay there in silence, listening to the sounds outside slowly die down. Eventually, whatever it was wandered off into the woods. The campsite felt quiet again. It wasn't until the next morning that my dad admitted the truth. It had not been a raccoon. It had been a bear. A fully grown black bear maybe 15 feet from our tent, sniffing around and helping itself to the leftovers we had stupidly left on the table. He told us he didn't want to scare anyone, especially my mum, who probably would have freaked out and made noise. He knew the bear wasn't being aggressive, just scavenging, and figured it would leave on its own if we stayed quiet. And it did. Looking back, I'm impressed. That moment taught me a lot about staying calm under pressure, and of course, never leave food out at a campsite. When I was in year 7, our all-boys school organised a week-long camping trip at our national park. The teachers had booked an entire campground well in advance. It was supposed to be reserved just for us, no outsiders. We were told we could use both shower blocks, one male, one female, since we were the only group staying there. It was meant to speed things up, avoid queues, and give us a bit of freedom. One afternoon after a swim, I headed to the far shower block, the one originally designated for women, with a few of my friends. It was quiet, with no one else around. My best friend took the cubicle beside mine, and we joked through the thin, damp partition as we rinsed off under the barely warm spray. I stepped out of the cubicle with a towel slung around my waist, still dripping, still laughing, and froze. Standing directly in front of us, barely a few meters away, were 3 completely nude European backpackers, 2 women and 1 man, all older, probably in their 20s. They weren't just passing through. They were casually undressing, chatting with each other like it was just another day at a hostel. No shame, no awareness, and they looked right at us unconcerned. We stood there stunned. My friend stopped mid-sentence, his face draining of color. One of the women met my eyes and smiled faintly, like we were the ones who'd wandered into their space. I remember the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. The intense confusion, the way the tiled floor suddenly felt ice cold under my bare feet. It happened in a matter of seconds, but it burnt into my brain. We scrambled out, barely remembering to grab our clothes. Later we found the backpackers had ignored the signage and wandered onto the campground, assuming it was public. No one had noticed until it was too late. The teachers apologized, brushed it off, and told us to forget about it. But we never did. Even now, decades later, the memory creeps in at odd times when I'm in the shower alone or lying in bed at the dark. It wasn't just awkward. It was deeply unsettling in a way I can't fully explain. There was something about being a child suddenly exposed to that much unfiltered adult intimacy that stuck with me. I've camped dozens of times since. I've seen bears, heard screams in the woods, even been stalked by one. But nothing has disturbed me as much as that moment in the shower block. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening in today. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's selection of camping stories. I'm going to be hitting you up tomorrow with some Ouija stories. It's going to be good. And then next week, a whole new batch of topics for you. So I think I might just read them out for you just so that you're forewarned. So let's have a look. Home Alone on Monday, Haunted House on Tuesday, Attic on Wednesday, Basement on Thursday, and Cabin on Friday. So we can call next week sort of like home week, because it's everything that happens at home, or like a cabin is like your home away from home, isn't it? Anyway, that was my logic when I put that week together. I hope you see it as well, and I hope to see you there and tomorrow. But I'm going to wrap things up now. A huge thanks as always to my members and patrons who give me a small amount of money every month in exchange for exclusive stories and other cool stuff. Well, that's it from me. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.